Why not? It's her lecture. She can do what she wants.
Hand whatever she wants, whenever.
Come on in. You're still at GTU?
Yes.
Yes? Wonderful. Good evening, everyone. Please come have a seat. Please come find a seat. Please come find a seat.
Sure.
This is great. Good. Good evening. Nice to have everybody here. It's a little chilly out, but it's good to be together, and we'll keep it warm in here. Welcome to VBS College of Jewish Studies, where we learn Judaism on a university level with no tests, football team, or sororities. So thank you for coming tonight. This year we're doing a survey of Jewish history, and we've divided our survey of Jewish history into 4 sections: biblical, rabbinic, medieval, and modern. We're in the middle of the medieval Jewish history period. I'll introduce our speaker in just a moment. But to give you a preview of coming attractions, our speaker next week, which is next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, same place, same brownies, is Professor Sarah Stein, who's a history professor at UCLA, and she's an expert in the history of Sephardim. Now, Sephardim are those other Jews. If you're like me and you grew up in a Litvak household, or a Ramaynisha household, or an Ashkenaz household, and for you, Jewish cooking consists of borscht, kreplach, borscht, gefilte fish, borscht, brown bread, and borscht. There is a group of Jews who really know how to cook. There's a group of Jews who are colorful, their music is beautiful, their poetry is magnificent, their cooking is out of this world, and there's a deep color and music to their lives, and they're called Sephardim. They were refugees from Spain a long time ago. They found their way to places like Turkey, Italy, and the Middle East, and they have brought the Jewish people all the color and all the beauty of Jewish life, and she's going to help us understand them next week. So anyone here of Sephardic background? Oh, a few of you, Mazel Tov. You're going to have to help us understand. What did your mama serve on Friday night? See, barekas are knishes, but they're really good ones, right? What's mantigos? What are mantigos? Yeah? Every culture in the world has a knish. They just call it something else, right? Samosas, right? Right? It's a beautiful, so come next week and enjoy that. Then we're going to turn the page brutally, because this is why it's a survey class, and we're going to enter Jewish modernity. And we're going to take an overview of Jewish modernity, and then we have 3 individual sessions to help us understand the history of Jewish modernity. My dear friend, Dr. Gil Graff, who's the head of the BJE and a student and teacher of Jewish history, will come and talk to us about the religious life of Jewish Germans, German Jews, Jewish Germany. And then we're welcoming Steve Ross, who's professor of history at SC, who just published the most wonderful book about the Nazis in LA and the Jewish conspiracy to stop them. If you didn't hear him on the radio, he's been on the radio a bunch. It's a marvelous story. Turns out that the Third Reich targeted Los Angeles in the 1930s as the center of their American activity, and they were stopped by a group, you don't even know their names, but he knows them because he researched them, of Jewish activists who made sure that they were ineffective. And it's a marvelous story about Jews and American power. And then we'll finish with Daniel Stein-Koken, who's a lecturer at UCLA, who's going to help us understand how Zionism in Israel has changed our self-image as Jews. That's going to be our discussion of modernity. We'll finish at the end of February. The next week will be Purim. We'll all come in. We'll have a little shikr. We'll get a little drunk. We'll do groggers, and we'll finish our study of Jewish history with a great celebration. So that's our course. I hope you'll come. A couple of other quick announcements so that everyone knows what's going on. Friday night, we are going to do a belated celebration of Martin Luther King's birthday. Friday night, right here in the synagogue at 7:30, we're going to welcome all the residents and the choir and the music of Beit Tshuva, and we're going to welcome the Faith Central Bible Church, the best gospel choir on the planet. These people rock and roll. They are marvelous. God, if only they were Jews. But they're just marvelous. It's a wonderful, wonderful choir. So come Friday night. You have never heard a choir like this. These people are fabulous. and the music is moving, and it's beautiful, and it's magnificent, and it's going to be our celebration of the prophetic legacy of Martin Luther King and the Jewish community's activism in support of civil rights. So please come on Friday night at 7:30. And then lastly, there's a bunch of other things going on in the shul, and you can get flyers for all of them. We're going to Israel in March. We're going from March 7th to March 15th. Those of you who've never been to Israel before, this isn't your trip. Your trip is the one in the summer with Rabbi Hoffman. This trip is for people who know a little bit about Israel, but want to learn about the issues and dilemmas that shape modern Israel. We're going to do an issue a day. We're going to go visit the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. We're going to go talk to settlers on the West Bank. We're going to talk to ultra-Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem. We're going to understand how Israel ticks. And then every night we go to a great restaurant, eat a wonderful meal, drink a lot of wine, and celebrate the gift that's Israel. So if you'd like to go, this is Alana. Alana, raise your hand. This is Alana. She has all the details about how to come to Israel with Rabbi Feinstein and a wonderful group of friends. You'll want to be on this trip. So see Alana after the class, during the class, before the class, during the week. Call the synagogue, and she'll take us to Israel, okay? Now, we just passed these out. Don't look at these yet. Instead, stand up, put the papers on a chair, turn to the people beside you and say, good evening and welcome. Hi.
Ashley Bernstein's daughter.
Yeah, welcome.
And I'll see you next month, February 14th at Temple Bethel San Pedro.
Are you going down there?
No, I'm a congregant there.
Oh, good.
And
Wonderful.
Every time you come down for the Taos lecture, I
I'm
send
so
them a
glad. I'm so glad. All right, now don't sit down. Stay up. Put your arms around each other. Draw each other close. We have the gift of learning Torah together. We have to make a bracha. Ready? Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom. Yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Please be seated. Amen. When we decided to teach Jewish history this year, and we understood the impossible task of teaching 3,500 years of Jewish history and the history of Judaism in just a few sessions, we decided that one of the best ways to do it was, once we got a grasp on the major issues of each era, is to examine one or two key personalities. That extraordinary personality who both embodies the moment and guides and shapes it. So when we looked at the Bible, we looked at King David with Rabbi Walpe and the prophet Jeremiah with Rabbi Zoe Klein. When we looked at the rabbinic period, we studied the stories of Rabbi Akiba with Professor Geraboff. And tonight, we're going to meet the most extraordinary Jew of the Middle Ages. Many people think he's the most extraordinary Jew, period, of any age. And because he's so extraordinary, I decided I'm just going to invite him. So I wrote to the Rambam, sent him an email, Moses Maimonides, called the Rambam, and I invited him, and he agreed to come. And he was coming, and it was all set. He agreed to the fee. He gave me his transportation. We were going to go pick him up. We were going to take care of it. And this afternoon, wouldn't you know it, he writes me and he says, Rabbi Feinstein, I'm so terribly sorry, but I scored Lakers tickets. And as much as I really want to come learn with your people, listen, the chance to go see, the Lakers lose again, why would anyone give that up? So I said to him, my God, Rambam, holy Rambam, what am I going to do? He said, listen, I'll send you someone almost as good, someone who understands me better than I understand myself. And so tonight, our guest is the chosen one of the Rambam himself, Professor Dr. Deena Aronoff. Deena is a world-renowned scholar of Maimonides. She teaches at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. She's well known throughout the community as a wonderful expositor of Maimonides' thought and his vision, and the wonderful personality. I wouldn't say wonderful. The extraordinary personality of Maimonides, kind of a moody fellow, as it were, and a guy who would stand me up for Lakers tickets. And most of all, most extraordinary of all, he's Mesh and Evelyn's niece, right? So the chance to bring your niece down and you should shep a bissel nachas from a great teacher of Torah who's your niece, that's not a small thing, That's a gift that we give to each other. Please welcome a dear friend, Professor Deena Aronoff. Now, in order to get them to hear you, you have to speak right in this microphone as if it were a lollipop.
Great.
Is that good?
Yes.
Good. Enjoy.
Thank you so much. And I've been here before, and I've been amongst some of you and with some of you before, and it feels like family. It is family, and it feels like family, which is very nice for someone who's traveled to come on in and to teach. I always think it's very significant to travel somewhere to teach there, because I get that sense of needing to justify all of the work and the expense of coming here. And I think that spending a night talking about Maimonides is absolutely one of those worthwhile trips. And in a survey of Jewish history, it's arguable that there's not that much room if you're going to have to, as Rabbi Feinstein said, you have 3,500 years of history to cover. It's a little bit hard to justify spending a full session on one person. After all, we understand that Judaism is a collectivity. And what's most important in many ways is what the collective, what the kehillah, what the community is living out. And I mean, maybe I'll put it a little bit more strongly. I would even say that we have a healthy aversion to honoring a particular person in our tradition. And instead, there's an emphasis on who is it among us who really understands the tradition. We defer to the tradition, as it were, and the people who rise up in the status in our community are people who can claim to be bearers of the tradition. There's a classical Talmudic term, the major foundational rabbis of the Talmud, the earliest stratum of rabbis in our tradition, were called Tanaim, which is an Aramaicized version of repeaters. I mean, it's the most humble name of a teacher, is someone who can say, I can faithfully repeat what I've been told. And those are our greatest sages. That's Rabbi Akiva. Now we understand that the sages did have personality, and there isn't really any such thing as a kind of perfect transmission. We leave our fingerprints over everything that we transmit one generation to the next. But the ideal that we have, I think, in Judaism is that the people with community authority are people who we understand to have received the tradition and are somehow faithful to it, who somehow in how they teach manage to produce a resonant rendering of the tradition. And it's only in a community like this, I think, that studies Torah so regularly and has such beautiful teachers among you. You practice this all the time. Collectively, you've begun to recognize faithful renderings of the tradition. Gershom Scholem was a great scholar of Jewish mysticism, and he, at some time in his career, wanted to understand is there any constant in Jewish thought through the ages? He was studying Kabbalah, which developed in the medieval period, which was in many ways unlike what we find in the Talmud and unlike what we find in the Torah. And so once in a while he would step back and wonder, is there a constant? Is there one kind of thread that cuts through all of these developments in Judaism over time? And he came up with this phrase that whatever Rov Shlomei Emunei Yisrael, something like this, whatever the majority of the people have come to recognize as a true tradition is a true tradition. And it's not entirely stable, but there's a subtle mechanism by which the Jewish collective sifts through it's the teachers and the traditions and recognizes what is true in the tradition. The Rambam, therefore, I would say, is an exceptional figure because despite this general sensibility I just described, where our sages are to some extent subordinate to the tradition, he rose up as a personality, as Rabbi Feinstein put it. An exceptional figure in that sense, whose way of rendering the Jewish tradition, and he did attempt to render the tradition in its entirety. And his rendering of the tradition was immediately, in his day, recognized as a masterful, authoritative synopsis and review of halakha, of Jewish law, and also of Jewish thought. Although I know that Josh Holo talked with you about the controversies related to his philosophy, and we'll talk about that today as well. But he was someone who reproduced in his own language kind of huge collection of halakha. The Yad Chazakah, as Rabbi Feinstein reminded me, another name for the Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the Torah in many ways, and we'll talk a little bit about what his halachic works were all about. But he produced what was recognized as an authoritative code of Jewish law and an authoritative synthesis of the philosophy of his day with the tradition. And he did this while retaining traces of his personal style. That's what I think is interesting. For example, the code of law that preceded him, that was most authoritative, was that of the Rif, the Alfasi, who was from North Africa. The Alfasi's code, this is how he produced a code. The Talmud is many, many volumes, much discussion and debate, storytelling, free association. It's an ocean. The Talmud is a full ocean, which, as a friend of mine likes to say, the Talmud assumes that you've read it already. Tzvi Septimus, a colleague in rabbinics, has said this, which is a bit discouraging if you're considering a deep dive into the Talmud, but once you get used to it, you can become one of those students of the Talmud who has, in a sense, read it already. But the way the Rif did his code is he said, okay, the Talmud is filled with debate. I can see, however, what is becoming the consensus about halakha and normative practice. And so what I'll do is I'll drop out those opinions that are no longer binding in terms of Jewish practice and produce a code that is, in a sense, just an abbreviated Talmud. So that's how faithful and, in a certain sense, anonymous the Rif was as he produced a code. It's not anonymous. Everybody knew that it was the Rif's code. But what the Rambam did in his halachic project is he reconceptualized Jewish law, halakha, rabbinic practice, infusing it with a certain philosophical sensibility. So the first volume of his Code of Jewish Law is called the Book of Knowledge. You have an excerpt from it in your laps. We'll get to it. Where he felt that a basic orientation towards the divine and an understanding of what God is and is not is a foundational, important beginning to a Jewish life. That's an innovation. I mean, some of you might be familiar with a certain caricature about Judaism, but I think there's something to it, which is that nobody checks what you're thinking and what you're feeling. The metric for participating in Jewish life is in your hands and feet. Are you showing up? Are you a part of the community? Are you helping out? Are you walking the walk? And to some extent, there's even a rabbinic dictum that says, gadol hamitzuveh ve'oseh. The best is that when you're commanded to do it. If you just have a kind of swelling feeling of sentiment and love, and that's what's really drawing you towards a certain practice, there is a rabbinic position, I'm not saying it's the only one, that's not as, let's say, not as high a status of religious performance than the one that's done simply out of a sense of duty and obligation. So for the Rambam to author a code of halakha that has as its start a discussion of the nature of God and one's basic, I think of it as an orientation, like setting your kivun, your direction, and your kavanah, your intention, that's where his magnum opus of halacha begins. That's already an innovation in how he simply conceptualizes the halacha. The influence that the Rambam had on the development of Jewish life from his point forward is so enormous that it really is worthwhile trying to understand what his worldview was, because there isn't one strain of Judaism today that doesn't, to some extent, hang its hat on how the Rambam formulated and rendered halacha, certainly, Jewish law and norms, and also Jewish thought. So let's dive in a little bit more about what it is that he produced. I wanted to say one other notable element about the Rambam. I think he had a pedagogical inclination. And I think that's a big reason why we're sitting here studying him as well. There are many geniuses on this planet. I think the Rambam was one of them. But it is rare, I think, for someone to have that level of intelligence, but have a sense and a wish to impart it to as many people as possible. That's what I mean by pedagogical sensibility. I think that Rashi was one of those people. Rashi, the medieval Ashkenazic exegete whose comments is the basic kind of guide as one reads the Torah, certainly in traditional communities, Rashi knew the entire corpus of rabbinic midrash and agadah and storytelling. I mean, I'm thinking of an iCloud, the cloud we were talking. His mind was a perfect, searchable engine of knowledge of midrash, and he took that acumen out of the quiet of the study room where he presumably acquired it, and into a pedagogical turn to a more common reader to say, what's a good midrash that really makes this verse sing or resolves some of the problems in the gapped nature of the text? And he brought those midrashim. Another way to understand what Rashi did is maybe he also knew what midrashim were on people's lips already, and he codified it. So he was a master of midrash who cared to teach it and to make it available through his gloss, through his commentary. I think another person comes to mind, and maybe if there's time we could hear of others, that Rav Adin Steinsaltz, who I think might be ill at this point, but he was another person. He knows the Talmud backwards and forwards. He wrote a Hebrew translation of the entire Talmud, which that might sound funny because you're thinking, wait, isn't the Talmud in Hebrew? But it's in rabbinic Hebrew, parts of it, but much of it is in Aramaic, and certainly not accessible to a contemporary Israeli speaker. He wrote a commentary for the entire Talmud. But he's also a Kabbalist who writes meditations on the Zohar. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he also was the dean of an elementary school and high school in Yerushalayim. So that kind of coupling of mastery of the tradition and the humility and the service involved in wanting to give it over, I think that the Rambam had that. And I say that because he also is famous for being quite arrogant in his pursuits because of his way of taking the ocean of the Talmud and presuming to distill it into an authoritative code without leaving any record of the minority opinions and not leaving any way to kind of check on his positions, to call his code of halacha the Mishnah Torah, which was the name of the book of Deuteronomy, and which means a repetition of the Torah. All of this was, to some extent, a bit presumptuous. I think at the core, he saw himself as a custodian, as it were, of the tradition, and he did have a sense of what in the English is called the severe vicissitudes of his times, and wanted to ensure the integrity of the halacha of Jewish law and that it be available to people, because for the Rambam, halacha and Jewish law was a kind of balm or a therapy that when practiced was meant to bring a person to such a state of equilibrium and good judgment, and therefore blessing and health. So it was a sense he had of the urgency of it, but I will say he did presume to step into a position of great authority in relation to the tradition and innovated a lot in terms of the form of how the halakha is presented. So I've been emphasizing for now in many ways, the exceptionality of the Rambam. He was an exceptional master, not just of the Talmud, that is the Mishnah, and then the discussion in the Gemara, but then of the Gaonim, which I know that Josh Holo talked about last time you met, those heads of the academies in Babylonia who in many ways were the ones who oversaw the final redaction and compilation of the Talmud, but also helped to apply the Talmud to everyday life, which wasn't so easy to do. And they wrote lengthy letters and correspondence that became, in many ways, authoritative texts. The Rambam took these layers of tradition, he took his observation about what had become normative practice, and he codified it. I believe that the reason why the Mishnah Torah became an authoritative code of Jewish law is because people recognized his halachic decisions as reflecting Jewish norms. The Rambam was not in isolation musing upon these texts and deciding on his own what position was legitimate and what was not legitimate. I think he knew which traditions were being lived out and had authority by virtue of their communal resonance. And not that they were made up, they were drawn from Talmudic positions, but he had his ear to the pavement, as it were, and that was reflected in his code. The innovative elements of his code are not actually so much in terms of the details of halakha, that's the bulk of it, but also how it's arranged. And I won't get into this too much, but I highly recommend Moshe Halbertal's recent book called Maimonides, Man and Thought, where Halbertal spends a lot of time talking about how the very organization of the 14-volume Code of Jewish Law is indicative of the Rambam's kind of legal and theological reasoning. So I recommend that book very much. So on the one hand, he's exceptional because of his mastery. And on the other hand, he's authoritative because he's representative of dominant norms. He wasn't actually innovating in terms of halakha. He was providing a clear, already digested, presentation of halakha. This is also true in terms of Jewish thought and philosophy. So we'll switch gears for a moment, and I titled this talk, The Real Rambam, The Many Faces of Moses Maimonides. One of the big puzzles with the Rambam is that he's famous for writing the Guide to the Perplexed, which, as you know, if you were, again, I was briefed briefly about what you did with Josh Holo, but he did talk about the great controversies surrounding the writings of Maimonides. So we need to talk about what those controversies were. But in many ways, when he wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, he was writing at the, I almost want to say, if you can imagine, Jewish philosophy in the medieval period really gets going in around the 8th century, the 700s, 800s, 900s, 1000, 1100. Maimonides lived from 1135 to 1204 in Fatimid Egypt. And he was, in a way, writing almost at the tail end of what is thought of as a kind of golden age of Jewish life in the Islamic context. What he did is he synthesized, and again, it has so much to do with the beauty of his writing. He wrote the synthesis of Greek thought and rabbinic and biblical traditions that became the authoritative form of Jewish theology from the medieval period moving forward, but not because he innovated the ideas there. I think it had much more to do with his style of communicating it. Because for centuries already, you had Jewish intellectuals who were taken up with the trendy way of thinking about God, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the Rambam is the one who managed, almost like an architect, to restore the structure of religion, to make sense of religion through that prism of Greek thinking. So what I want to do in the next chunk of time is explore his philosophy and then return to the mitzvot, to the commandments, and we'll see how it goes. The Guide to the Perplexed created a very big stir, as you know. And the main challenge that this Greek-infused way of thinking about God poses to the tradition, I would say, comes from something very central to this Greek worldview that was popular among all of the intellectuals throughout what's sometimes called the Islamicate, from North Africa to Iraq, and eventually slowly up into Christian Europe. And that's this: the God as defined by Aristotle in antiquity and Plato, and then later Neoplatonists in late antiquity. No quizzes, right, Rabbi Feinstein? We're okay? Okay, so you can, don't worry about those names. But a basic element of that worldview, and it's interesting to think about today where we're at on this, but the basic element is that what is divine is unchanging. The definition of divine perfection for the philosophers of the ancient world, but also the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers of this time, was that God radically transcends the changeable nature of the material world. What we experience, I'm hot, I want to take this scarf off, I'm sitting on one side, I have to shift to my other hip. All of change for the philosophers is a function of materiality and all of its limitations. We live for a little bit of time, and then we give our bodies back to the earth. There's a temporal nature to material form. Comes together, comes apart. That, said the philosophers, cannot be the nature of the divine. It must be constant and therefore divine. And many of these theologians, I'm talking about mostly Jewish and Muslim, felt that observing the natural world, and in particular the planetary movements, if you're able, through astronomy, observing the movements of the stars and planets is as close as you can get to observing divine movement, because it is so perfect, unceasing. It is the pure animating force of the natural world. That is as close as we can come to seeing how the divine governs this material mess that we live in. Now, many of these theologians had a big problem to face after that, which is, well, wait a second, so does that mean everything's determined? If the way that everything works is through a perfect, unchanging set of causal structures, then what is religion all about? And that was basically the problem that the Rambam had to address in the Guide to the Perplexed. And we're not going to read it together, and this I decided even on the plane. It's not just because we're running out of time. But the first page on your handout is the introduction to the Guide to the Perplexed, where the Rambam describes, I think, very passionately, the problem for the intellectual of his day. Here's the problem. You've gone to university. He's talking to a very elite audience. We can also talk about the Rambam's elitism if we have time as well. This elite person who's gone to the universities, who studied the sciences, who studied astronomy perhaps, who has come to understand the causal nature of things, then turns themselves over to look at the tradition that they grew up in, that nurtured them, and they see that it's filled with, what to call it, all kinds of silliness, superstitions. If I do this, it's going to rain. If I don't do this, then there's going to be drought. And God is listening, and maybe even God has a mighty hand that pulls the people out of Egypt, and Adam and Eve are in the garden, and God is walking through the garden. And what is God nothing more than just a larger version of humanity? So this is a major crisis for the intellectual. And the way he describes it there is to say, what shall I be drawn on with my intellect and come to understand what I know to be true? Or shall I just shut the door on that? Stay faithful to the tradition, stay practicing, stay a part of the community, and just let go of what I've come to know is true. And what the Rambam says there, I think, is a surprising response to that. He says that option of closing off the intellect in order to be faithful to the tradition is a disservice to the person. He says, because you will have headaches for the rest of your life. And he was a doctor, and I think he meant it. I think he meant you will have, headaches. And second of all, that is no service to the religion, because religion at its core is actually meant to enable the awakening of the intellect so that it can come to know what is true. And that is communion with God. So he's basically turning to all of the Jewish intellectuals of his day, many of whom would just say, well, I don't understand. Why should I? He even has a letter, some people saying, they stand in the back of shul on Sukkot, and they see people dancing around holding a palm branch and an etrog, and they're thinking, whoa, that's not for me. And they're kind of snickering at the back from that philosophical perspective to say, we know that God doesn't really respond to how we move about the synagogue or what ritual items we take up. So there was a real skepticism about the commandments that came from this philosophical position. The Rambam came in and said, and I believe that this was not apologetics, the Rambam came in and said, please understand that the use of your intellect is to exercise the one part of humanity that is actually itself divine. The human faculty of the intellect, that is to observe and come to know what is true. That's the highest faculty that humankind has. And the religious life is in the service of that awakening. So when we come, he spends the rest of the Guide to the Perplexed actually going through a lot of the terms in the Torah that, if read plainly and simply, do seem to indicate rather crude things about the nature of God, like God's arm or humanity being created in divine image. Does that mean God has a face? So it's almost like a book of biblical exegesis in the first part of the Guide to the Perplexed, where he goes through the most highly anthropomorphic sections, where God is rendered in the most human kinds of ways, and explains it mostly allegorically, so that the intellectual can still have respect for the text and understand what it's really trying to communicate. Now, so many people again say, so if he was such a radical philosopher, if exercising the intellect, and in many ways, if coming to understand the natural world was actually the highest form of spiritual life, why did he write a 14-volume code of Jewish law? And it is another recommendation, I will tell you, the Mishnah Torah, the 14-volume code, continues to be a very accessible review of halakha. It is still, if you say, I'd like to learn about the laws of mourning, there are amazing contemporary books that have been written about the laws of avelut. You can still go to either in the Hebrew, he wrote it in a beautiful Hebrew. You can read his Hebrew, or you can read a wonderful English translation. His exposition on the laws of mourning is a systematic, accessible review of what those halachot, what those laws are. But again, you want to say, why did he devote this kind of time to halacha, if to some extent the details and the contingencies of human experience, God has no access to the particulars of these individual moments. God is actually to be observed in the much more steady and constant causal structures that you can mostly observe through the sciences. And so this has actually led some people to say, you know what? There are different faces to the Rambam. Sometimes he was thinking one thing, but as a community leader, he would say something else. In other words, he was talking out of two sides of his mouth kind of thing. But I do believe that a full understanding of his worldview, once you kind of get the grasp of what his real take was on the religious life, then you can see that, of course, he spent time on these 14 volumes of Jewish law because he had a profound appreciation for how the halachic way of life can cultivate the kind of individual and social well-being that is absolutely necessary for us to reach our transcendent actualization, which I say with a lot of longing right now because I sometimes despair at where we are as a human society in manifesting the abundance of our intellects and what we know to be true. So the Rambam, I want us to understand his approach to the mitzvot. That's where I want to do our deep dive. So for that, we do have a handout. And you'll be happy to know it's the larger font sheet that says at the top, Moses Maimonides' 8 chapters. Okay? And I'll do a little bit of hopping around, but we will read some of it directly and closely. And again, my goal here is for us to appreciate that when the Rambam devoted himself to the mitzvot, to the commandments, it wasn't some kind of, like a kind of affront that he would put on for the masses, but among the intellectuals, he might kind of say otherwise. He had a profound sense of the salutary effects of the mitzvot. The way that a doctor has a sense of the salutary effects of what he or she advises of their patients. And I mention that metaphor intentionally because when he talks about the purpose of the mitzvot, he does it in a short treatise called 8 chapters. He uses the analogy of the human body. And so let's get into this together. The first section there, it says, concerning the human soul and its faculties. First thing the Rambam does in that short paragraph is he lays out what he thinks are the constitutive elements of the human being. The nutritive or the most basic growing faculty that a plant would have, or any living thing that has to metabolize things for energy so that it can persist. The sensitive faculty, the capacity to take in information. Then the imaginative, which for Maimonides, and it's not just Maimonides, it's his Muslim contemporary Al-Farabi that he's drawing from, and it's all drawing also from Aristotle. The imaginative faculty for these folks is the part of the animal psyche that can retain images, a kind of residue of sensory experience. It's very important for us to be able to do that. It's basic for our animal function that we have a sensory experience and then retain some of that in our imaginative faculty. But the example he gives when he discusses it a bit further is to say, because we have an imagination, we can see a ship and a bird, and then we can imagine a ship flying. So the imaginative faculty can actually take some of these sensory experiences and play with them. It's a very strong faculty, but it's still very linked to sensory experience. The appetitive, which is, he's going to define in a moment, and then the rational. Now, the appetitive from appetite is that faculty by which, and I'll just update this to say person, but we can talk about the Rambam and gender if we have time. A person desires or loathes a thing, and from which there arises the following activities: the pursuit of an object or flight from it, inclination and avoidance, anger and affection, fear and courage, cruelty and compassion, love and hate, and many other similar psychic qualities. For the Rambam, and again, he's not exceptional here, he's not innovating this. This is his contribution to Jewish life because he's taking these philosophical understandings of human nature and writing it into a Hebrew. This appears as a comment on I think Pirkei, now I'm forgetting the formal name of 8 chapters. All of those passions, basically, he says, that's the appetitive faculty. And here is the, I think, pretty radical comment in the next paragraph. Know that transgressions and observances of the Torah, that's the term there for law, have their origin only in 2 of the faculties of the soul, namely the sensitive and the appetitive, and that to these 2 faculties alone are to be ascribed all transgressions and observances. So let me kind of tease out what I see here as significant. What the Rambam is saying is that if you almost could imagine the people of Israel standing at Sinai and receiving the Torah, the way that we might get a prescription from a doctor, the mitzvot are directed at this faculty, our passions, our appetites, the way that we're drawn to some things and reject other things and love and hate. It's basically all of the dark, messy stuff of human nature. That is where the Torah is directing itself, with the hope that through steady practice and a regimen of steady performance of mitzvot, all of the natural imbalances that we experience in the realm of the appetite will become neutralized. Because for the Rambam, the only way that a human being can understand things truly or see things truly is when that appetitive faculty is calm. And it's almost like a clear lake. If there's a lot of movement in the water, then you can barely get much of a reflection of the environment. But when the lake is still, it's such a perfect reflection of the environment. To truly see and to understand one's environment, there is a certain appetitive calm, says the Rambam, that is absolutely necessary. And the mitzvot are the RX. Lucky us. We got the best one out there, he's saying, of these are the practices. And so here's where he says, basically, what is a good deed, and the word there is not mitzvot, he means actions that are positive are those that are equibalanced, not too much and not too little. And then he goes on, and I'm guessing there are some therapists out there. It's a Jewish crowd. But what he's basically a behavioralist in that next paragraph. He says, these moral excellences or defects cannot be acquired or implanted in the soul except by means of frequent repetition of acts resulting from these qualities which practiced during a long period of time accustoms us to them. This is why it's really important. We are the company that we keep. It's like, who do we hang out with? We basically become. What he's saying here is, you want to arrive at a state of equanimity, practice these mitzvot again and again. And then he gives this great example. Oh, and so he's really a doctor here, and I could have shown you some of his medical writings where he was still operating in the Greek model, which is, if you're very phlegmatic and have too much moisture, then they would prescribe dryness. And I know there's Chinese medicine-trained people here in my family. So this notion that people's constitutions are going to stray and get imbalanced, and the therapeutic approach is to restore the balance by suggesting the extreme opposite. So he actually says that the Torah, in what it demands that people give away, and he gives this list, which I think is supposed to really impress this upon us, giving of tithes, the gleaning of the harvest. So, the little things that fall when you're harvesting your fields, you're not to pick them up. You allow, this is from the Torah law, forgotten sheaves. I love this one. You've harvested all this wheat. You bound and put together some sheaves, but you forgot a couple of them in the field. You may not go back to retrieve them. Single grapes, this is in Deuteronomy. You're harvesting the vineyard. You pull the full bunches off. Don't go back and pull the little ones. Leave that again for the poor, which I try. It helps that I have 2 little kids, and now they make sure that I do this. But I think that small change at the end of the day could be the modern monetary version of the small grapes on the vine. At the end of the day, I have that from, a little bit of change, and a lot of times I kind of want to keep it and pull out the quarters for meters, and I have a whole, and I just say, if I were a farmer, those would be those little grapes. Put them in the tzedakah box. It goes on, the small bunches in the vineyard, the laws of the sabbatical year, the jubilee, the giving of charity according to the wants of the needy one, all of these approach the extreme of lavishness to be practiced in order that we may depart from its opposite, namely stinginess. So basically, he thinks the Torah requires extreme amounts of giving because human beings have an extremely can have a fearful nature that draws them to be very possessive. The Torah has to say, open your hand for the poor. Don't close their hand. I can feel the Torah trying to pry open this fearful, clenched fist of the infant even, through this kind of extreme requirement to give and to give and to give. And then he says, and if you should, that says text, but I typed that up, that's a typo. The last 3 lines of the page, if you should test most of the commandments from this point of view, you would find that they are all for the discipline and guidance of the faculties of the soul. And this was his belief. There are some mitzvot that the medievals had a very hard time finding the utility in them, like the prohibition of blending mixed species of wool and linen. And Maimonides doesn't really resolve that problem of the chukim, these laws that don't seem to have a utility to them. He nevertheless insists on coming back to the therapeutic benefits of the mitzvot, and they are that gift. And what he then does to the Jewish people, basically, what he then does, and here's where I want to will conclude with one more text. You can see why it is now that the Rambam is actually a very integrated thinker. There aren't many Rambams, Rambam for the masses and Rambam for the philosophers. There is a real Rambam that had fully kind of integrated the mitzvot into a very rigorous intellectual worldview. And he is able to recover, by the end of his project, I think, a sense of the values of religious life. So what I wanted to do is look at the concluding paragraphs to the Book of Knowledge. So as I mentioned, the Mishnah Torah is a 14-volume code of Jewish law. That was innovative too, I should add. Every other code until that time, I mentioned the Rif, followed the order of the Talmud as a kind of commentary to it. But he systematized it differently, and to him it made sense that the laws of prayer appear right after the laws of knowledge, and that's where he put them. So he took a lot of initiative in the organization. The Book of Knowledge, the Mishnah Torah, it's the first volume. It's sort of a digest of a lot of the philosophy that he goes into in greater detail in the Guide to the Perplexed. It is meant to be a more accessible version of basic philosophical ideas. And chapter 10 is the last chapter of the Book of Knowledge, and he reflects upon the religious person and the ideal or the aspirations of the religious system. In the first paragraph, and we won't read this together, the first paragraph he warns about not following the commandments because you're afraid of punishment or you're seeking reward. To him, that is a very tragic state of affairs, because basically you're missing the boat. As long as you remain, in a certain sense, subordinate that way, say, I'm so afraid if I don't follow it, I'm going to get punished by an external being, that is God. God will punish or reward. Part of him is thinking, it's not thinking, he actually says this, then you're serving out of fear. And that puts you at some remove. Here's what it is to serve out of love. And this depiction, to me, it moves me every time. In paragraph 2. Whosoever serves God out of love occupies himself or herself with the study of the law, the Torah there, and the fulfillment of commandments, and walks in the paths of wisdom, impelled by no external motive whatsoever, moved neither by fear of calamity nor by the desire to obtain material benefit. Such a person does what is truly right because it is truly right. And ultimately, happiness comes to this person as a result of this conduct. Do you see that he actually recovered the biblical language of reward and punishment, but in a much more naturalistic way? This person who has lived and practiced the mitzvot and has therefore arrived at some sense of equilibrium and understanding, that person is going to have a certain contentment. He's intentionally writing this so you can read it in different ways. Happiness will result because God rewards this person with happiness, or happiness is the innate, natural result of this kind of alignment. I sometimes, because he says the person moves with no external motive whatsoever, I do sometimes think a little about yoga and other physical movements where you do all of these contortions, but actually the goal is to be able to sit comfortably without, ideally, needing any supports, because internally you've figured out the architecture of your skeletal system, your muscular system, and you have found balance. And all of those contortions are, at least in the, these yogic teachings, are in the name of a comfortable seat. And he's saying that that's the person who has found wisdom. And they do follow the commandments, but because that's just the kind of blossoming, natural blossoming of their nature. And I'll share one other text. I didn't hand it out to you. It's a kind of remarkable, similar point that he's making in the end of the Guide to the Perplexed, where he says, a person who is fully awakened to he's using a lot of God language. He would say, who has awakened to God, who understands that there's a divine animating entity that courses through all of life, and we're participants in this. Once one wakes up to this, their behavior becomes constant in every domain of their lives. He says, when a perfect person understands this, they achieve such humility, etc., that, and here's the quote, that their secret conduct with their wives, so what he means is sexually, domestically, who we are physically, and in latrines, how we go to the bathroom, is exactly like their public conduct with other people. I met someone, I had the privilege of having regular contact with a staff person where I teach, that had that quality. I could just tell, no matter who he was talking to, he was the same person. I just couldn't believe it. He again, in terms of the hierarchy, sometimes people sound differently when they're talking to someone who's, cleaning the bathrooms or getting the coffee, or then the president of the university walks in. But then you meet those people where it's the same conduct, no matter who they're talking to. That kind of alignment is the alignment that the Rambam believes can be achieved through the practice of the mitzvot that ideally enables, first of all, I should tell you, social well-being. He thinks that's a first step, a priority for anyone to achieve spiritual heights is actually social welfare of the larger community, because he believes actually we're fundamentally interdependent. So there's no way for the individual to get to a state of equanimity without the society being also in a state of peace. So that has to be established. The individual can have the privilege of study and training and can awaken the intellect. But all of this happens through a process, and the mitzvot have an essential place in it. So to conclude, we're very lucky to have the Rambam on our shelves. We really are. And there's wisdom in how he formulates the purpose of the commandments that can awaken a certain motivation and a desire to take on the practices very seriously. And he recovers, I think, a full integration of the dominant intellectual kind of paradigm of his age with the tradition. And this, I think, was what was most exceptional about his person and why we're still talking about him today. Thank you.
Lots of questions. Got lots of questions. I want to know, for example, if you believe in that kind of naturalist universe. So you don't believe in miracles. Do miracles exist? And what's a prophet? And how do you read the Bible? If you take miracles and prophets out, then it becomes a very different book. And how did he get along with the other rabbis of his age? Right? I mean, you said that he's fun to have on your bookshelf, but it'd be fun to have in your neighborhood. That's the question, you see? So we're going to ask some questions to Professor Aronoff, but first we're going to refresh ourselves with some coffee and some brownies. So everybody stand up. Come on back. Lots of things to ask.
Very nice. What a great...
Nice to see everybody.
Oh, I need a pen.
Here, I got one if you'd like. I mean, you can use mine. I had one. Yeah, use this one. I'll ask you. I made a bunch of questions I want to ask.
Great.
You know Micha Goodman's book? Have you read that one?
I know.
Micha Goodman. It's a good book. It's a good book.
Gotta
Yeah.
get to it.
It's easier to read than Halbertal's book because he's an easier writer to write.
A good man. Oh, of course.
The one I liked was what's his name's book? The guy in Chicago. Guide for the Perplexed of Today or something like that. It was a very nice
Also?
book. Easier book to read. Okay, good evening. Shh. The problem with Halbertal is he's like the Talmud. He knows everything. And if you don't know everything,
It's hard to read him.
He's wonderful. I mean, he's a brilliant guy. And a very sweet guy, very good guy.
Yes.
You know, he wrote Tohar Neshek. He wrote the Israeli Army's ethics manual. So when we studied with him in Israel, he would every morning when the newspaper would tell you, this is what they did. He would like, good evening. So I'm actually going to backtrack because I want to make sure that no one's confused. So let's first start with the really simple, 3 simple facts. Fact number 1: the gentleman's name is Moses. His father's name was Maimon. Okay? Moses ben Maimon. Moses, the son of Maimon. So far, so good? Okay? In Jewish parlance, you take a guy's initials and you form a name out of it. So if you take Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, Rabbi R, Moses M, Bar, Ben is a B, then M, you get Rambam. See, all right, now, so the game is, what would be your Hebrew? What was, if we did Rabbi Deena Aronoff, she'd be the Radah. You see? And the Rif was Rabbi Yitzchak Al-Fassi. So is the Rif. You see how that works, right? So you can figure out what your rabbi name would be, Rambam. When you take, in Greek, if you want to talk about the son of somebody, you add I-D-E-S at the end. So Maimonides is the son of Maimon. Get it? Same guy. One guy, all the 3 names. Is that clear so far? That's fact number 1. Fact number 2. So in rabbinic parlance, he's known as the Rambam. No one ever called him the Rambam. They called him Moshe, right? Rashi's Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. Reish Shin Yud. See how that works? Okay? Okay. Now, second thing. He's born in 1135 in Cordoba, Spain. Anyone ever been to Cordoba, Spain? It was once the most beautiful city in the world. And you can see it now because the mosque and so many other things. And it was the center of Spanish Jewish culture and Spanish culture in general because it was ruled by a very benign group of Muslims. But these Muslims were in trouble because the Christians were reconquering the Spanish peninsula. So they did a very, very difficult thing. They called in a group of Berber warriors from North Africa to push back the Christians. Once the Berbers had succeeded in pushing back the Christians, they decided to take power. So they deposed the government and they took power, and these guys were much more militant Muslims than the guys were in charge. This happened in 1148, which was Rambam's bar mitzvah year. So unfortunately, shortly after his bar mitzvah, he got the fountain pen and the certificate and the free year in USY. And the family had to leave Cordoba. And for some strange reason, the place they went was the last place you'd imagine they went. They went to Fez. Fez, the capital of Morocco. So they went right to the heart of this intolerant Islam. And I think the theory is this father was thinking that Fez is a huge city with a huge Jewish community, will be safe there. And that's where Maimonides went to medical school, okay, and continued to learn his education. Then the family trekked to Israel and visited Israel, but Israel wasn't a place you wanted to live, it was just a place you wanted to visit, right? And then they went to Egypt, and the family settled in Egypt, and they settled in Fustat, which was the big capital, the Muslim capital of Egypt, and the Caliph of Fustat was a Fatimid, means he was a very tolerant fellow, and he welcomed the Jews. And the next piece of the story is that Maimonides had a very great gift in his life. He had a younger brother who was a millionaire. His younger brother was an international merchant in diamonds, basically. And the younger brother supported the family, the whole clan. The father died in Israel, and the younger brother supported Moshe, and Moshe got to do 10 years of postgraduate education, which was 10 more years of education than anybody else in the world ever had. So in those 10 years, he learned everything. Mamish, everything. He learned all of Judaism, all of the books of the Jewish tradition. He learned mathematics, sciences, rhetoric, poetry, everything. And then a terrible tragedy happened. His brother died at sea. His brother was on a mission across the Indian Ocean. He drowned at sea. Maimonides spent a year, Rambam spent a year mourning for his brother. He was terribly depressed. And then when he got up from his shiva, got up from his mourning, he realized that not only did he lose his brother, he lost his livelihood. So he went to work as a doctor. Jewish doctors then, like now, were very valuable. And the caliph and the vizier of the caliph hired him, and he became the court doctor to the Muslim royalty. So here's a guy who by day is the court doctor to the government, sort of the Surgeon General, and by night is the most important Jew in the world. He's the leader of the Jewish community, the Dayan of the community, writing responses to letters from all over the world, people emailing him all night long, asking him legal questions. He's writing all these things. We have voluminous writings of his. Many were found in the Geniza in Cairo, which was that storeroom in Cairo where they kept all the old stuff. In fact, the last letter that he wrote was a letter to his translator. He had finished the Guide for the Perplexed very late in his life, and it was written in Arabic, and it was being translated into Hebrew, and the translator, Shmuel ibn Tibbon, wrote him a letter and said, I got a couple of questions, can I come see you? And he writes back a letter saying, I have no time. This is what I do day and night, and even if you came, I don't know if I could give you 10 minutes. And the story is that by the time Ibn Tibbon received the letter, Maimonides had died. He died in 1204, very young, at the age of 60-something. So, but the legacy, as Professor Aronoff told us, the legacy is the most remarkable legacy, because here's the guy who wrote the most important Jewish philosophical work in all of Jewish history, and the most important Jewish legal work in all of Jewish history, and the two of them fit together perfectly. Because what he was interested in is the way that you act and the way that you think. And that's my first question. Does the way that you act and the way that you think, does the way that you think matter for the way that you act? Mm-hmm. And why does he begin his law code? The first book of the 14 books of his law code is called Sefer Mada, which means the stuff you gotta believe. Did Judaism really have stuff you gotta believe? Right. I'm asking you like the Rambam if he was here, but he couldn't come because he's at the Laker game. But
and I mean, one of the other texts, just to strengthen your question, he also in one of his letters issued a list of 13 basically principles of faith. You can even call it doctrines that he wanted Jews to subscribe to. And it raises the question right away, wait a second, that's deviant. That's not how we do it. Judaism doesn't demand of you that you subscribe to a certain creed. I think, and this had to do, if you recall, I said that he had a pedagogical instinct. well, I'll throw something else into it. The Rambam is often accused of being an elitist. The reason being, if you think back to that depiction of human nature that we read together, where we have the basic kind of metabolizing properties of what it is to be a living being, and then sensory and imaginative, and then the appetite, and then the intellect. The intellect for the Rambam is actually divine. It is an element of the divine that inheres in the human being, mostly in potentia, and then it can get actualized through life experience, training, and studies. He believed that very few people actually have the opportunity to actualize their intellect. Mostly we live like animals, basically. This is why one of his ways of thinking about the eternal life, he says, is basically, if at any moment, if any point in your life you managed to not always be determined by your appetite, but actually to have awakened the intellect in a pure way, you've awakened an eternal property, that is the intellect, and you've therefore achieved eternal life. I think he had some sadness about the fact that most people were going to live and die like dogs, and that very few people were going to have access to the kind of life and well-being, security and peace, and then training to become philosophers and to actualize their intellect and to commune with God in that pure, blissful way that he thought was actually possible for human beings. I think he wrote that creed, the set of beliefs, and he started the Mishnah Torah with the Sefer Madah in order to kind of awaken, even in the masses, correct beliefs, so that they even stood a chance, I think this would, to acquire even a scientific and clear, true understanding about how things work. There are a lot of contemporaries who would still find this off-putting, but I actually think that's what he was after. He wanted to say, oh my goodness, please don't think that God is actually kind of human form and has moods and gets angry and is going to strike you and withhold from you and then grant you. And I mean, if you could, this is basically what he's saying. Let me just tell you a few basics. For him, by the way, subscribing to a set of beliefs without fully coming to understand them is meaningless, and it doesn't transform the person. It doesn't awaken the intellect. He didn't think it had any kind of power to subscribe to these beliefs, but it was just a kind of introduction, like an elementary introduction. God has no body. God is complete, perfect unity. God has no particulars, but is one perfect element, etc. It was just some attempt to bring what he thought was the correct, he uses this language a lot, correct beliefs and opinions to people who are never going to go to graduate school, basically. And it was almost like he was distressed at the thought of people forever living in the fear model of reward and punishment, and never having any opportunity to transition to the love model, never getting to that place of performing the mitzvot in that way without any external motive whatsoever, but from a full understanding. So I think that's what was compelling him to try to set out a set of correct opinions and beliefs.
So I want to pursue this a second. So he starts out by saying, God doesn't have a body. Right? God doesn't have a body. Now, but there's a problem with that, right? Because I opened the Torah, and what does the Torah say? God smote the Egyptians with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. That sounds like a body to me, right? The face of God. Moses saw the face of God. Then he saw the back of God, right? Then it says, God got angry. So Maimonides says, right, don't take those literally. Those are all metaphors. Got it? Those are all metaphors. But now here's the problem, Doc. Ready? Metaphors? Where do the metaphors end? In other words, how far can I take that? Let me give you the hardest case, right? The line that's repeated most often in the Bible, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe lemor, or V'daber Adonai el Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moshe, and this is what he said. But if God doesn't have a hand, and God doesn't have an arm, and God doesn't have a face, then God doesn't speak, because God doesn't have lips. So what does it mean when it said God spoke? So what does Rambam do with that? And at what point do I metaphorize God into nothingness? Or at what point do I lose any connection with the meaning of the Bible, because it's all basically what I decide it means? You see the problem?
Yes.
Great.
I'm pausing because I know that Rabbi Feinstein has an answer as well.
No, I have
It's
no
a
answer.
setup.
No, I have no answers at all. No, I have no answers at
Yeah.
all. I come b'tmimutai.
Yes.
I come to ask a great scholar a question. I want to
It
ask
is
Rambam
true.
this question.
It is true that the whole, the Torah and Revelation becomes a bit of a, at least initially, a problem. This is when I was saying the Guide to the Perplexed was an attempt to resolve the basic tension between a certain view of God as unchanging and without body and particular form, without a history, without even a will, possibly. So how do you take that level of an abstract divine force and reconcile it with the most pathos-filled, relational, responsive, speaking, leading, listening God of the Torah? Creation, the Exodus, everything. God is responsive. God is a character in the Torah.
Right.
And all of those are that's a very human depiction. This relates to how the Rambam defines prophecy, which is what you mentioned before we took the break. The Rambam did believe that human beings can have direct access to the divine. And the divine for him, again, would be is a kind of natural perfection. I'm drawing from Moshe Halbertal's book again. Moshe Halbertal, at the end of his book, he says, some people say, but what about the miracles? How could God perform miracles? And Moshe Halbertal says, are you kidding me? Instead, what the Rambam says is the everyday natural world all the time, every second. Why would we want to hang our hats on something that happened then? No, the whole natural world, when fully observed in all of its structured and timely and beautiful kind of causal, and all of it is divine, says the Rambam. Halbertal is saying that I like that model. That's not to resolve the problem of miracles. How does the Rambam resolve creation? It's a big problem, not just for the Rambam. It was a problem for Plato, who tried to figure out how, if one has a very abstract notion of a causal entity that perhaps is constantly governing the material world, how does such a process ever have a beginning? How does matter come into being? So this was a problem for the Greek thinkers, and Maimonides inherited that problem. So the Torah itself, I hate to say it, poses a problem. What did God speak to Moshe in a human language?
Yiddish.
Yiddish, exactly. We have a translated text.
Exactly right.
For this reason, the perfection of Moshe as a person and as a prophet is very important for the Rambam. What Moshe is to the Rambam, put aside how the Torah even depicts Moshe. What Moshe is a person exactly as we described at the end of the Mishnah, at the end of Sefer Hamadah, the person who came to understand what was true and what was beneficial through a kind of process of prophecy, coming such a full communion with the divine that the person can transmit to others what is true and what is beneficial and what is a good law, not innovating it themselves, but transmitting what came to be understood through that experience of prophecy.
gonna
But
stop.
in other words, and
Yeah.
I'll just end
Yeah,
it.
go ahead,
In
go ahead.
other words, the Torah, though, the text that we have, to some extent is a kind of translation of the wordless, ineffable prophecy of Moshe into what could be heard by the people. And the Rambam leans a lot on that rabbinic phrase, the Torah spoke in the language of humanity. When the Rambam says it, he means it very seriously. And it is a very fine line. What he's saying is the Torah is the perfect law given by Moshe to the people as a result of his experience of perfect prophecy.
So let's pursue that. So we have this unchanging God. And you have human beings who have the gift of intellect, but most of us are too distracted by bad television, okay? And Twinkies and the animal life,
Yes.
right? And so what's prophecy? Now, in the popular imagination, prophecy is a fellow walking down Ventura Boulevard and God shouts to him, "Yo!" And the guy, that's the popular imagination, right? But he has a different idea of prophecy.
Yes, it is the perfect philosopher. And people say, but Moshe is complicated. He's very human, and he gets angry. And the Rambam tries to work that out a little bit. But I actually think that when the Rambam says Moshe, lo kam bi Yisrael ke Moshe, oh, there was never a prophet like Moshe, what he means there is that Moshe was our perfect access to the Torah, that Moshe could give us the Torah because he could commune with God so fully. And the Rambam thinks that the other types of prophecy, even like Yechezkel, or prophets that use a lot of imagery and language or fall asleep and have visions, he thinks of those as more imperfect prophets where you can see their imaginative faculty at play. Whereas Moshe was like, he says, like an aspaklaria me'ira, like a lit speculum or a lit lens glowing, again, like a surface of the lake, a total still channel that could communicate the divine perfectly.
So the idea is he's the fully realized human being. He's controlled his animal impulses, he's quieted his desires, and he's allowed his mind to grow. So prophecy is not from top down, it's from bottom up. It's people, right?
Right. That, it's funny, that last point is what the Rambam says. I wish I could find it in here, but he says that, yes, that there's a priority he gives to awakening the intellect. That has priority in substance, but in time, the priority is physical well-being. That one has to tend to physical well-being. That takes priority in time, though it's all in the service of that higher capacity that human beings have through awakening the intellect.
So let me ask you a simple rabbi's question, right? If God doesn't change, why should I pray?
Yes.
So I had all these questions for the Rambam, but he wouldn't
Yes.
come tonight, so I'm asking you like his representative, right? So
I would say that, first of all, the Rambam's definition of prayer is very basic and primal, and he deviates a little bit from the rabbinic consensus of his age. He thinks that there's a biblical command to pray, which simply means a awakening of the heart, turning to God in a very natural kind of way, unscripted turn to God. That he then thinks the rabbis systematize through their obligatory liturgy. There's interesting gender implications here because as a result, for the Rambam, women are obligated only in that biblical command to pray, but the rabbinic obligations fell only on the men in a more time-bound way. Whereas for Rashi, it's ironic, where there's no biblical command to pray, which there isn't a clear command to pray, but the entirety of the obligation to pray is rabbinic, and women are included in that obligation. So this has been a kind of hashed out understanding. The Rambam believe that there's an obligation in the Torah, in the Shema, that tells us that we must turn our hearts to God. I think that he would say that's the kind of orienting that is necessary for the good life and for enlightenment and for knowing God. But the typical liturgy that says, please give me this, and please give me that, and please give me this, I think that the Rambam thinks that our tradition has certain imprecise, no, I'm trying to think of the word, that's the fear model.
Yeah, right.
And he thinks that there is fear language. The fear paradigm is in the Torah, and it's in the liturgy. And here's where he can sometimes come off as elitist. He would say that's because most people don't have the opportunity to seek God in this more loving, knowledge-based method. And since this inferior mode is still better than nothing, we still have the inferior modality coursing through biblical language, because Dibra Torah b'lashon b'nei Adam. So the Torah spoke in the language of human beings. Human beings respond to reward and punishment. So there it is, as a necessary compromise to the state to the human condition. And it's even in the davening, but it actually does not correspond to the highest truth. It's even worse than the metaphor. It's worse than saying that the Torah uses metaphor. It's actually saying, no, at times the Torah employs fear-based, kind of incentivizing, because that's how most people will get to participate, and participating is still better than not participating. That's why I think, ironically, his famous or infamous creed, depending on what you think of his 13 principles, it was actually an effort to be more egalitarian about it. I'm not just going to and he had a gendered notion, I'm not going to just let the masses and the women just carry on having silly beliefs about how God is going to respond to them if they do this or that. I'm going to tell them the truth. That's not how it works. And so he really did kind of want to equalize things in that way.
So I know that when he died, the rabbis of the world basically ganged up on him.
Right.
How come?
So
They burned his books.
Right. So first of all, what's interesting is the book that you would think would not be controversial, the Mishnah Torah. It's a code of law. It's so normative. It's so useful. That irked some of his contemporaries because he wasn't operating in the normal rabbinic mode, which is you make a halachic decision in a moment in relation to a situation. Of course, those decisions add up to a set of precedent law that can then be consulted, and so they become binding decisions, but it's supposed to have a much more ad hoc, real-time quality in terms of making a halachic decision-making. And then he goes ahead, makes the decision, and doesn't even include the Talmudic source, doesn't include the minority opinions. It was it actually, in a certain sense, undermined the Talmud. Because now you don't go back to the Talmud and you don't go back to the Gaonic writings. You just read the Mishnah Torah. So even his normative text of Jewish law provoked some people who then wanted to kind of take his text and bring it back to the pages of the Talmud. The Guide to the Perplexed, I think, mostly got into trouble in Europe. And I'm just thinking now on my feet, but I think that there was some kind of intolerance, some kind of difficulty with the free-thinking philosopher in Christian Europe that may actually reflect dynamics in the Christian world more than particularly Jewish ones. The Rambam never lost status in the Arabic-speaking world for centuries.
But in the Christian world, but among Christian rabbis living in the Christian world.
Yes, and the way they burnt the guide is by reporting it to Christian authorities as heretical.
Well, they own the matches, you know.
Right. So the normal reading of it is they owned the matches. They were the ones equipped with a whole kind of tribunal that could review these ideas, assess whether they're heretical. So the rabbinic authorities sort of leaned on that apparatus in order to burn the guide. But another way to read it is to say the rabbis were living in this environment of a kind of fearful sense of which ideas are kind of outside the bounds of appropriate religion.
Yeah.
And we're participating in a certain kind of narrowing of what is permissive religious discourse.
So when you read him, this is my last question, and then we'll ask him. When you read him, and you've read him a lot, you know, what is it in him that you find fascinating, interesting, engaging, infuriating? When you read him, as a person, as a reader, you engage in a dialogue with this soul, right? David Hartman was my teacher, and he once told a funny story that he was a little kid in yeshiva, and they came around the yeshiva and they said, "We're collecting money." He says, "What for?" "We're going to have a little party." He says, "Good. What's the party for?" "This is the 750th yahrzeit of the Rambam." And Hartman looked up from his desk and said, "He's dead?" When did that happen? And they said, "Reb David, he's 750 years." He says, "He can't be dead. We were learning together this morning." I mean, when you read him, you have to read him very slowly and very carefully, and pretty soon you end up arguing with him. I don't know about you, I argue with him over the page, and sometimes I'll catch him, you know? I say, "I knew you were going to say that. I just knew that's where you were going," right? When you read him, what is it when you read him and you say, that's why I love this guy, or that's why he infuriates me?
Right.
What do you like best?
Oh. I think that the end of the Book of Knowledge is the point where I kind of, it's this kind of crest in his writing, and I definitely crest with him, where he had, that we read together, and even just the paragraph just following it. I have a sense when he's writing this of such alignment in him, that he is writing in a perfect alignment with what he's writing, that this image of the person whose activities flow from a grounded and enlightened sensibility, that is the paragon of the religious person. That moves me, and the description of that, I like to aspire to that how one is in private, in the most mundane contexts, and how one is in public, that those would be the same. That is a paradigm. That's what it is to be a religious person. It moves me. And he actually concludes by saying that this love paradigm of relating to God is linked to knowledge of God. And the knowledge is acquired through learning. So he also has a process, there's a process to prophecy, for example. It doesn't just kind of strike a person for random reasons. It's the culmination of a learning process. And what's acquired in the learning is a knowledge, and for him that's the same as love. And I like that too, because I think we, live in what's thrown around as romantic love and desire. It's all, well, I don't know. I won't make generalizations about what love means in kind of common popular parlance, but what love means to him is to know. And I think that that's true interpersonally. It's like, what an honor to be in a position to steadily get to know another person. And if that is simply the definition of love, like Dayenu, forget the fireworks and the craziness and basically the appetitive faculty, which is basically romantic love, desire and rejection and all of that. But to locate love in the intellect, what he means by that is he's locating love in the faculty of observing, coming to know. He's talking about coming to know God, but I see interpersonal applications to it as well.
Great. That's wonderful. All right, we got a couple of minutes to some questions. So Louise is the mistress of the mic, and we'll let her bring the mic around. And please make your question a short interrogatory. Begins with the words what, why, and why, where, and how. Yes, please, Bruce.
Could you talk a little bit about Maimonides' view of evil and decay in the world? And I always viewed him as kind of embracing the negative aspects of the world and saying that those were necessary in order that we could have good things in the world, and how that interacts with your view, with your description earlier where you said that for the Greeks, permanence was a sign of godliness, and how those might interact.
Yes. I mentioned Gershom Scholem during the talk, who was a scholar of Kabbalah, probably known to many of you. And one of the reasons why Scholem was drawn to Kabbalah is because in the Kabbalistic imagination, God has many aspects, actually, and many of the dynamics that we experience in life are playing out in the divine realm as well. So there's a right side that is generous and giving in the divine realm, and a left side that is withholding and restricting. And when the two are not in balance, then we're out of balance in the below, if it is out of balance above. And Scholem felt that that kind of mythic thinking, where God is, it's the opposite of the philosopher's God. God is filled with color and dynamics that in many ways correspond to our experience, different in quality but still mirroring one the other. Scholem felt that that did a much better job accounting for evil in this world and suffering in this world and the nonsense, the lack of sense in this world and the lack of justice. And he was drawn, I think, to Kabbalistic myth because of that. I mean, Scholem was a person who left Europe and witnessed the destruction of European Jewry from Palestine, and was sent back, I think, by Hebrew University in 1945 to collect books from the destroyed communities. I mean, like the most tragic remnants of European Jewry. And he had no tolerance, therefore, back to Scholem, for this philosophical way of dealing with evil, which was simply to say that the only way that God is any meaningful way, the agent responsible for our experience, is in the far great sweeping kind of causal structures of the natural world. But the details of it, an earthquake, a cancer, that can't be linked to a divine will, and certainly not kind of reward and punishing. But even God choosing, there's an impossibility of the permanent, steady, regular divine movement being responsible for the accidental properties of our material existence. So for Scholem, that doesn't cut it. You cannot do Jewish theology where your explanation for evil and suffering is that it's the accidental properties of what it is to have a material body. And I think there's a strength to that position that I'm attributing here to Scholem. I will say that it is arguable that his approach to suffering, which is that much of it is caused by the accidents of our bodies and our appetites and our natural constitutions, can provide a little bit of comfort, because so much suffering can come from the thought that there is some kind of sense to it, or that we can control our illness or our situation. And there actually can be a little bit of relief from some sense that we're material beings who are subjected to the causality in a very basic way. But I will admit that for some, that is not a sufficient response to the problem of suffering.
Okay, where's the mic? Please.
Deena, you talked about the Greek philosophical background and tradition of the Rambam and you talked about the Jewish milieu, but the Rambam did not live in the time of the ancient Greeks, and he did not live in the time of the rabbis of the Talmud. Instead, he lived in the Arab Islamic world of his day. To what degree did that milieu impact on his thinking, his philosophy, and the writings that he put out?
Great. I mean, obviously I can't give a full answer to that, but what I would say kind of jokingly is that probably, yes, no one called him the Rambam. They probably called him Musa. Mm-hmm. So he was thinking in Arabic, writing in Arabic. And for example, his treatise on the mitzvot that we read together is in some regards fully just lifted from the Islamic jurists, basically halachists, and thinkers of his day. So this is where I would go back to when I started and I said, part of why he's such an important personality in our tradition is not so much because he was somehow exceptional and innovative, but actually because he was artful and had a particular genius to produce the formulation of what had become a dominant way of thinking, and in that case, Jewish and Islamic way of thinking. So much of his genius has to do with his mastery of the traditional sources and of Greek and Muslim philosophy, and his capacity to synthesize it in ways that were resonant. It's almost impossible. I would like to look into it, maybe somebody else can, but in one of the, I don't know if I handed it out to you, but when he talks about loving God, he says, like Avraham, who is called God's lover. That's in the last section there. And I made a note to myself on the plane ride down here, I don't know where that tradition comes from. And then I thought, I wonder if it's in the Quran. And I have a student at the GTU who wrote a thesis about how when he talks about God's indwelling, and he's writing in Arabic, and he says Sakinah, and that's a very important term among Sufi Muslims in his time. Is he thinking the Muslim term and writing it? So basically, it's almost impossible to tease him apart from his Arabic-speaking world and all of the Muslim kind of associations that draws along, even with his word choices.
I think the motivation, too, if I could add one piece. In Christian Europe, rabbis didn't feel like they had to justify Judaism against Christianity because the communities were so opposed to each other, and because there were no Jews who were earnest to go become Christians. So the rabbis could turn inward. The Christian Jews and the Christian communities would turn inward. So the myth of the superiority of Judaism was an inward language. Rambam's living in a time when Jews are partaking of this Islamic world. And they're asking the question, well, if this Islamic world is so welcoming, if it's so intellectually sophisticated, if it's so aesthetically sophisticated, architecturally and artistically and beautiful, maybe that's what I should go do. And so the guide is written as an answer to the question of how can I use the same intellectual tools that apparently are undermining my Judaism to reestablish it, to reformulate it. It's an answer to pluralism. And only in an Islamic setting, in that one moment of the Middle Ages, first in Cordoba as a boy, and then in Fustat as a man, does he live in a pluralistic society. Which is why the Guide to the Perplexed it's an impossible book to read, by the way. If you weren't perplexed at the beginning, you would be at the end. But why it's such a modern book? Because it really speaks to Judaism in a pluralistic moment. How do you live among other faith traditions and still hold on to your own? That's the other piece of it. That's another piece of why the historical moment motivates him. Who has the mic? Yes, please.
How does Rabbi Schulweis relate to Maimonides? Because they seem so.
How does Rabbi Schulweis relate to Maimonides?
Yeah, because their conception of God.
Right now they're playing chess, I think.
No, but I meant their conception of God seems so different. I don't know how. Rabbi...
as a matter of fact, I wrote on this, so I can tell you really quickly. Number one, Maimonides method becomes the method that every modern Jewish philosopher embraces, and every modern Jewish philosopher will justify his work by Maimonides' method, because he's going to say, look, just like Maimonides, I'm going to use the tools of philosophy and the culture that I live in to justify my Judaism. So the culture that might have eroded my Judaism instead is going to strengthen it. So whereas Maimonides uses Islamic Aristotelian philosophy, Schulweis is going to use American pragmatic philosophy. John Dewey via Mordechai Kaplan. Actually, then Feuerbach via Mordechai Kaplan. That's number one, okay? Number two, really quickly, because this is a long lecture, and I'll give this lecture one day because it's absolutely brilliant. You'll want to come and hear it. The Guide for the Perplexed. It's this massive book. It's a letter to a student. He had a student who had to interrupt his Jedi training in the middle and go back to become the chief rabbi of Tunisia, because his father was the chief rabbi of Tunisia. He died, and the kid had to go back to be the chief rabbi of Tunisia. So my mind says, you didn't finish your training, I'll write it. It's like what Yoda would have written to Luke Skywalker. I'll write it out for you, right? And the whole thing, and the whole purpose of the Guide for Perplexed is to figure out, how do you get to know God? How do you get to know God? It's exactly what Professor Aronoff talked to us about, right? And it's a complicated pathway up the mountain. And the metaphor is that metaphor, because Moses Maimonides loved Moses. And the great Moses adventure of climbing the mountain is exactly the metaphor he uses in the guide. I'll show you the pathway up the mountain. So just like Moses, you too can stand face to face and know God. And that's what he does in the book. There's only one thing about Moses' life that Maimonides couldn't figure out. Once Moses got to the top of the mountain and faced God face to face, as it were, then he goes back down to the people. He comes back down to all the tsuris, all the mess, all the conflict, all the revolts, all the schmutz of the world. If you achieved philosophical nirvana and got to the top of the mountain, wouldn't you stay there? He doesn't answer that question until the last page. Mamish, the last page of the book. It's a huge book, impossible to read. If you ever get to the last page, he gets to the last page, and on the last page he says to his student, so, Boychik, he says, what's it all about? It's all about achieving perfection. And he quotes a verse from Jeremiah. And he says, you know, some people think perfection is having all the money in the world. He says, money's nice to have, but that's not worth striving for. Some people think it's being the most beautiful body in the world. That's nice too, but not to strive for. Some people think it's about being morally perfect. That's also wonderful, but that's not the most perfect thing. The most perfect thing is to know God. Except the verse in Jeremiah goes on one more line. And the verse in Jeremiah says, so that you may do justice, truth, and righteousness. And in the last 3 lines of the whole book, he says, that's really the goal. The goal isn't just to know God. The goal is to do God in the world. To come down the mountain and to bring Mishpat Tzedek and to the world. Right? It's Mishpat, Tzedek, and what's the third one? Anyway, to bring justice, truth, and righteousness to the world. In other words, for those of you who know Rabbi Schulweis's thought, the last line of Maimonides is the first line of Schulweis. Because what Schulweis taught us is that, how do you worship God in the world? Living a life of godliness. Schulweis's whole notion of predicate theology and godliness is an interpretation of the last 3 lines of the Guide for the Perplexed. Okay? That's why they're playing chess right now. So, who else has the mic? Who has the mic? We're going to do one more question.
Okay.
And
Right
then,
here.
Please.
You mentioned that Maimonides was a doctor and had great intellect and was after having postgraduate education for 10 years, which was an awesome thing to have some 800 years ago. The question is that he knew God and divinity by the study and using his intellect as opposed to faith. Does that mean that we who have not put in 10,000 hours of study and work will be basically loving God in terms of faith as opposed to our intellect.
Or fear.
And then the other question is
Wait,
how
wait.
has Maimonides influenced our way of thinking in the 21st century?
All right, let's first do the first one. Do you need to be as smart as the Rambam to do Rambam's Judaism? That's a really interesting question.
I think that's one of the hardest questions. That's why I have such a charitable reading of his creed. I don't know what else to call it, the 13 principles, because I understand why they're off-putting. Again, like in Judaism, we don't do that. You don't have to sign somewhere and say, I believe in this and I believe, no, there's no catechism. That's not us. But because I think that for him, it was a lifeline that he wanted to throw, by lifeline, I mean eternal lifeline. To say, if I just say, okay, there's going to be a whole group of people that are just going to think that God has a face and an arm and gets angry and is going to punish and reward, not just let them live out their religious lives in that paradigm, fear paradigm, because that's all they're really capable of, and I'll reserve the philosophy for the trained intellectuals. And he didn't want to do that. And so he did posit that these are the correct, this is what is correct in terms of the divine nature. But I told you, then he can't win either way. Damned if he does, damned if he does. So he puts the principles of belief in there, and then it looks like he's dogmatic and enforcing a set of beliefs on people. I don't think he wanted to do that, because actually he thinks that if someone unthinkingly just subscribed to them because they had to, then nothing was achieved. That is completely meaningless. I think he was hoping that that list would prompt people to think critically when reading the Torah and considering the purpose of the commandments. So he wanted to access, for as many people as possible, to access what he thought was the true nature of God and the true purpose of the commandments. But I do think that he thought that most people remain in the in a incorrect paradigm. And you know what we really needed is an evening where we have a full discussion of a counter position. Because I'll say this. The Torah, for the Rambam, is not directed at the highest faculty of the intellect. The Torah is directed at our passions and appetites in an effort to condition us, to ready us to know God. That's a demotion. I mean, think about how the Torah is framed in more traditional context. The Torah is the marriage contract between God and the people of Israel. It's not just some utility kind of prescription to manage our appetites so that we're able to do loftier things. So, you can object right there to how he's characterizing the Torah as I said, in a very utilitarian kind of way. So I lost my train of thought, but just to circle back to your tough question, I think he does think that most people never really exit the very determined path of our imbalanced appetites and natures. And we spend most of our lives being pulled this way and that by our appetites, and very rarely do we access what he would think of as our highest faculty. And furthermore, he does think that access to that faculty almost always requires training. So it's making, I'm just kind of reflecting back to you, that it's not that he thinks that some people he probably does think some people have greater capacity than others intellectually, but that's not the big problem. The big problem is that everyone has the divine intellect inhering within them, except that some have the privilege of access and some don't. Men and women, by the way. He often clusters women with this group of people, the vulgar, the common folk, who cannot attain a true understanding of God. I don't get totally offended by those sections, because the way I understand them is what he's saying is, sure, they have an intellect, but they have zero opportunity to cultivate it. So they're basically going to be determined again by the material demands of life. And there's almost as if to say there has to be an element of leisure in order to engage in the kind of knowledge of God that he so values, that for him is the very purpose of our existence. But I think that the big question then is, where does that leave the rest of us?
Good, good. I find one of the things about him that fascinates me, and I think it may be the answer to your second question, is for him, Torah, Judaism is truth. Now, but in modernity, we think of Judaism as it's my culture, it's my identity, it's my community, it's my way of life. He says, yeah, all that's fine, but that's not the most important thing. You don't die for any of that stuff. You die because it's true. You know, it's 2 + 2 = 4 is a truth. Torah is a truth. And if it isn't as evident to you as 2 + 2 = 4, then you're not doing it right. And that's a really interesting question to 21st century Jews. Like, what is it in your Judaism that is a truth, a deep, hardcore conviction that can't be compromised? That kind of truth, ultimate truth. And that's what I find in him. That's, to me, the hardcore of the Rambam. What do you find? Hardcore of the Rambam.
I have to think about it. But yes, the Rambam, I kept using this term integrated. There's nothing left. He has fully accounted for the elements of the tradition in a way that I think that has a lot of integrity.
Yeah, it really is. It includes everything. There's no loose ends that he hasn't included in the system, that isn't explained by the system. Great. Let's thank Professor Deena Aronoff. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Next week, we do Sephardic, so come bring your colorful soul, and we'll do Sephardic Judaism. Please come back. And Friday night, come for Gospel Judaism.